No, I just wanted to say that this is the last act of our conference. I'm delighted, actually, that we were able to get Cherian George, who many of you will know, and is a leading figure in the university, and is a dean, certainly the dean for research anyway, in the School of Media and Communications. And so Cherian is going to animate this debate, and we're going to participate as well as we can do.
Thanks so much, Alistair, and congratulations, first of all, for what I understand has been a very, very successful 2 days. I was able to dip in and out for a couple of sessions. Unfortunately, too many clashing appointments to attend the whole thing. But you know, it's of course wonderful to have this format, right? Which I'm completely unused to, because I realize it's superfluous to remind panelists to, for example, unmute yourselves and turn on your cameras. And, it's wonderful. I could actually touch you if I wanted to do something. It's bizarre. But so that was the old normal. Hopefully it'll be consigned to history. This is an actual physical event, but of course with a large online audience, I'm sure. We have, in the spirit of the conference, a multidisciplinary panel covering everything from physiology to public health to, what else do we have? Political science, geology, and so on, right? Area studies. And all of whom, of course, over the last couple of days have been focused on a wide range of topics related to COVID-19 and a post-COVID world. And I guess to kick us off, I'll just ask a fairly open-ended question, which is, what do you think are the main lessons that you hope leaders, policymakers, media, and the wider public will draw from the COVID-19 crisis, whether it's the medical, scientific, political, economic spheres? Yeah? What are the lessons for crisis management, for governance, for public discourse, relating to issues of trust and transparency, risk and resilience, and so on? Take a bite at this from your own fields based on what you've gathered in the last couple of days. Shall we start with Gemma?
Thank you. I'm honored to, I would like to say something about the healthcare. Oh,
you need the mic for the sake of the...
Test. Okay. Thank you very much. So my background, I trained in medicine and public health. So I'd like to say something, my own point of views in terms of the healthcare system. So as we know, the modern pattern of medicine is focused on chronic, non-communicable disease. So I think the professionals in medicine are quite full of experience in dealing with the non-communicable disease. However, so the COVID-19, the new emerging infectious disease, and so since the healthcare system has not been ready to deal with. So this I would like to suggest in the future to enhance the capacity to deal with the infectious disease. So that's my own opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps we stick with the broad area of medical, physiological sciences and so on. Julien, would you like to add on to that?
Yes, I think we need to be optimistically cautious, I believe, because we're getting the pandemic under control now with the vaccine, certainly, but with the new strains and the mutations, we've just got to be so careful. And there's a question early on in the conference about people being vaccinated. I think that total vaccination of the entire population is the way out, really. If we don't vaccinate everyone, the people that don't get vaccinated, number one, will catch the ordinary strain, and secondly, if we don't get everybody vaccinated, the mutations will come around again and affect us all, you know. So I think it's very, very important that, although we're quietly optimistic, we need to consider the future very, very powerfully, really.
Are there other perspectives from other sciences, including geology? Frankly, I was intrigued to see that perspective.
Geology in an environmental sense. One thing you can do from geology is actually put a time perspective on this. It's sudden, unexpected events are completely normal in a geological context. So we can expect this to happen again. And I think that we're all panicking trying to deal with this, and we should be. But we should now be thinking about the next one. And try and get it right the next time round. This time round, what's tended to happen is the panic, and then people have turned inwards. Countries have turned inwards. Even Schengen started falling apart. I think the world actually has to try and get a system going, and a completely international one that will be ready for the next pandemic. And to me, that's the biggest thing. It will happen again.
Right. And when you talk about the next ones, sticking to Bernhart, I mean, there's that saying that generals are always fighting the last war, right? The next one needn't be coronavirus. It needn't even be a pandemic. Right? There are other various...
I can give you many different ways to destroy the world.
Tell us.
Meteorite impacts, supervolcanoes. I can give you many different ways, but they're still the same point. There'll be an international crisis. The population of the Earth went down to just a few thousand people when Tambora volcano erupted, and that created a squeeze on the world's population. And when they talk about mitochondrial Eve and so on, this is the point that they're referring to when the world population's expanded out from that point. There is no reason why we can't go down to just a few thousand people again. I know ways to do it. So the thing is to expect the unexpected, right, and try to be as ready as you can. And I think that involves a large-scale collaboration, keeping supplies ready. If it's a supervolcano, we won't be able to help each other. We will break up. Societies will end.
So the broader lesson, I guess, is that the things that we take for granted are precisely the things that may, when any of these calamities happen, might suddenly be taken away from us. And we need to think about the things that we take for granted and see how we can mitigate.
Yeah, and there may also be very big regional crises. Right. They can be confined. If Hawaii collapses again, it's done that several times, the western seaboard of the US could be wiped out. There's an island in the Azores. If that one collapses, and it has done before, the eastern seaboard of the US will be wiped out. Now, if you imagine a disaster of that scale, wiping out Washington and all the other cities on the East Coast, that's something that has to be dealt with internationally.
Right. But are these risks that are simply beyond the scope of the institutions that we rely on for governance? And
so some of them are. Yes, certainly some of them are. If you have something that creates a nuclear winter type event, a meteorite impact, for example, that will mean your world food crops will fail. They could fail because of a disease. Most of the bananas are very genetically restricted. And one disease can wipe them out. We're thinking about pandemics of people, but there could be pandemics of crops. And how would we deal with that? So there are just so many ways. And the best thing to do is to try and cooperate as much as possible, which has not really been what's happened in this pandemic. It's still not happening. Look at the problems between the UK and Europe in terms of AstraZeneca. And that's really a panic-induced problem. It's not really very logical. Everybody should have said, well, okay, you can't deliver, but we'll try and help you build up your production. No, they didn't. There was this argument blew up, partly Brexit induced, but between UK and Europe.
We've now segued into politics, your domain, Alistair and Jean-Pierre. Would you like to?
I've got a couple of reflections, actually, on one on time and one on message, because, you know, Bernie gave us the long time frame. And I suppose, in a way, the difficulty about public discourse in this pandemic is that, in a sense, it's the extremely short time frame that's necessary for political leaders to address. And I'm thinking about the difficulty of a sure, constant, legitimizing discourse when you have to change radically very often. And I think about, because Emily's sitting on my left, I think about French President Macron. I mean, okay, it could be any other leader, it could be Boris Johnson, whatever, but just think about Macron in a sense, because Macron, I think he's been on the TV 8 or 9 times now. Every time the message has been a little bit different, you know. The first time the message was, this is a war, we're at war against this virus, we'll win the war. Then it was, so the message shifted every time. It will, when, quoi qu'il en coûte, whatever it costs, we'll come to the end of this pandemic. Now, of course, that spills over into other considerations, but the key point here is it's actually quite difficult for any politician to have a slow, consistent discourse. And we could say that I think really discourse needs to be authoritative, hence quite slow and quite reflected. But, you know, in a pandemic, particularly in a pandemic, in a digital age, you know, public discourse can't be that slow and reflective. You know, it has to accelerate. And so, you know, and that can create all sorts of problems. So that's really about the time element. I've got other issues I'd like to put in as well, but I think it's probably the point I've made for the moment.
Politicians, especially in the context of an election cycle, which a long term is 6 years, right? Is there just something systemically out of sync with the kind of risks that Bernhart is talking about?
I think it's an extremely important point, and it's one of the comparisons we've had throughout the conference really has been, you know, political regimes don't tell us that much, but they do actually tell us something, because they do impose different sorts of temporality in a sense. And I think it is true. One thing that's come out very strongly in our analysis, I think, thus far, has been that some types of let's say liberal democracies have actually found it quite difficult to manage this crisis, because there are numerous internal counterpowers, if you like, regions, as Tom Gnocchi said. In actual fact, in Italy or Spain, it's the regions that decide a lot of this. It's not the central government. So that creates a form of, stasis in a way. In the case of the UK, of course, you haven't been able to go from England to Wales for a very long time. You might be able to now, but it's only just changed, you know. So in a sense, I think the point about the democratic countries is that, in a way, they have to face the duty of transparency, in a way, as I said in my paper. That is, you know, it's actually extremely difficult, because it means that they're constantly being held to account for decisions they're probably not capable of taking on the basis of information they probably don't have. Whereas in other types of regimes we've been talking about, those constraints appear to be a little bit less. And maybe Jean-Pierre Cabestan's the best person to talk to that one.
Indeed.
All right. Well, I don't know. Yes. All right. Yes, the democracy is the worst system after all the others, of course. Now, democracies have been facing conflicting objectives, but not only democracies. You know, one of the big dilemmas of the crisis of the pandemic from day one has been the choice or the dilemma. You know, whether you give priority to lives or whether you give priority to the economy. You have to maybe stop or slow down the economy in order to save lives, in order to, but you can't do that in the longer run. You have to, at one point, make difficult decisions. And that's something which has not always been understood. Even, Trump, actually, because we haven't talked about Trump. Oh, we did talk about Trump during the conference, but, he made the wrong decision. But, I can understand why he made that decision, was to give priority to the economy, because he thought that that was the best way for him to get reelected. He was wrong because actually he miscalculated and he underestimated the magnitude of the pandemic. And but that's an issue which is, I think, which every leader needs to face. Now, among the lessons you've referred to, well, it's hard to draw lessons because, we sometimes in China we say history is a mirror, but the trouble with the history is we never swim twice in the same river. The water goes down and we swim in another river, and circumstances always change. As you said, we always get ready for a war which took place before, but never for the coming war. And one of the things is, coming out from the conference is that we need, leaders need to be not to be too positive, not to be optimistic, but not to be too negative, And maybe Macron went too far on that side, to sort of declare war against the virus. He used very, very strong words, and that was somewhat counterproductive. So there's a need to be vigilant, but also a need to reassure the public, and above all, I would say, to be consistent and to try to stick to the same kind of steady policy or strategy in order to make your policy credible. Now, different countries have, and that's something we've discussed earlier in the conference, have faced different situations. It's been easier for islands, for countries with borders to control the virus than the European Union. You mentioned Schengen. Yes, of course, Schengen has been put into, has been somewhat frozen for some time because there was a need to restore the authority of the nation state and for reassuring the public. And I think for political scientists, one of the lessons of the pandemic is the return of the nation state, and also and that's something which goes beyond the differences between political regimes, is the need for authority of the part of the leaders. And there's been a lack of authority, which means accepted leadership in quite a number of countries in the last few months. Now, the final thing I would like to say is, I'm afraid we will need to live with the COVID. We need to live with this virus, as we've lived with smallpox, we live with polio, and so vaccination the only way out. But I think there's already been a need to return to some kind of normality, so there is no risk-free society, and that's the problem. Of our modern society, we tend to be risk-adverse, a bit too cautious. And governments, they take precautionary measure, but it's a society without risk doesn't exist. And we may facing, I will end on that at this stage, other kinds of risks. You've mentioned eruption, but I'm working on international relations, looking at the tensions between China and Taiwan, and we may have a war. And what's going to happen? How are we going to react to? That's a new catastrophe. To have a local war which becomes a bigger war. And that's something we're not really ready for, I'm afraid. So that's. I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but it's another kind of risk we need to manage.
You still haven't reached the level of pessimism.
I can be more pessimistic than you. I haven't finished yet.
Scale.
We need to compete.
Emily, your takeaway?
Yes, thank you. I think what Jean-Pierre said about the return of the nation state is true, and we have seen that in the first months when the center of the epidemic has moved from China to Europe, and all of a sudden, European states rediscovered their borders and closed them down, and there was a surge of nationalism, of sovereignty and protectionism. That's all true, but at the same time, we have heard this morning and this afternoon about international organization and the role they play. We have heard about health and health union that is now being invented and built in Europe. We have heard about the need to build an international law structure and health international law. So we have collapsed a little bit into falling onto nation states, nationalism, but at the same time rediscovering multilateralism and the importance of globalization and global solidarity.
Emily, maybe I'll pass the ball back to you for my next question, which is that one of the complications that has emerged in our discussions is this tension between the nuances that we hope academic research will bring to the table, on the one hand, and the sort of the clear and simple public messaging that's required for effective public communication during a crisis. So the best research, whether in medical sciences or the social sciences, can't be reduced to a slogan, right? But strong calls to action often do require slogans. So how do you think we as academic researchers should manage this tension when we attempt to make interventions in public policy and public communication?
Oh, yes, that's a tough question, Cherian. Actually, I think that's right. There is this tension, but I'd like to highlight also another problem that we have seen with this pandemic, that is the infodemic. So we have a surplus of information that are true and some others that are fake news. And the tension is also lying between the public, how they can make use and understand and process this infodemic. So how they can reach out and digest all this information and separate the truth from the false. So I think that's the first problem that we have to deal with. And since we are speaking from a university, I think our first job, and you are from the communication and media program, of course, and school, this is even more important. That the first duty of ours is to teach our students to handle this infodemic. The second tension is the one that is of getting the message out there. And that relates to my first point, because I think the message is out there. But how can we make it that the public is going to grab it and to take on it? And that's the main problem. We have a lot of good research, and we have a lot of specialized journalists who are getting these simplified messages. We have a lot of media on all sorts of platforms, printed media, online media, that simplify the good research that is getting out there, but just people do not want to choose to listen to these messages, and they rather go for other forms of fake news. So I think the main issue is how to fight against this infodemic of fake news.
That's nice. In a sense, there's a supply problem. There's also a demand problem, right? So no matter how much we supply high quality and even well-processed information, what do you do with the fact that for some bizarre reason there's a demand for something else? Yeah? But this must be a frustration that you as scientists face or see all the time. Any views on that?
I think part of the problem with our work is that it's mostly published in scientific journals that not all the public read. And we don't seem to get a lot of media coverage, particularly in the university, strangely enough. And we've done a lot of high-quality research on the COVID pandemic, and there's very little of that gets out, except within the scientific community, i.e. the journals, the scientific journals. So there's definitely a mismatch in terms of information produced and information perceived by the public, the general public. I think as well that the schools have got a role to play in this, particularly the 16-plus children, the teachers, that, as we've just discussed briefly, that the pandemic or a pandemic will come back later on. And we need to raise awareness generally amongst the population about these things, and create interest and create a forum for discussion and debate amongst all populations, And I think that's very, very important, really.
I wouldn't be too pessimistic, though, because things do change. I first came to Hong Kong 30 years ago, and at that time I taught climate change, and nobody cared. But if I say that today, everybody will argue with me. Things do change, but it takes time. It probably does need institutions, though, not individual scientists, I think, because we're all very introvert. We know our topic. We don't want to have to talk to anybody else. But the institutions could make us change by giving more incentives to talk to on radio, on TV, and so on. The incentives are mostly about being academic. It's just begun to change a little bit with things like impact studies.
Can I come here? Because I think it's true, just to sort of pick up what Julien and Bernie have just said, because in a sense, our university, because we're here, I think has actually been very good in terms of the research undertaken on COVID-19. And I think in particular, when Professor Guo was here yesterday, actually gave a very, very interesting talk, I think, setting out what had been done. And I think this was actually it was a good talk. But the thing that strikes me is there's 2 points. One is, in a sense, that's action research, That's action research of the type that sets out to change the world for the good, okay? And in this case, it's to find solutions or to help recovery or whatever. So in a sense, that action research, I think, needs to be supported by public intellectuals, I mean, in a way, and that's maybe where we're not quite so good, actually. I'm not saying in Hong Kong Baptist in particular, but it's that, there needs to be not just the good scientific research in the journals, but there actually needs to be, we need to be present in the media, we need to be doing interviews, we need to be selling ourselves, as my colleagues actually in GIS are extremely good at doing that, but I mean, we need to be sure that we do that, because that public intellectual has a really important role to play, I think, in terms of the points you're making there, Cherian. Because it is true, the professional pressures to specialize increasingly, to get into particular journals and to get into particular niches of niches, it's difficult to reconcile that always with the need to rise up that ladder of generality and make sense, actually, of this complex world.
You mentioned the term public intellectual. It reminds me of the term that Jean-Pierre used earlier, which is authority, right? And, on the one hand, this crisis has demonstrated the fact that, globally, scientific authority is highly respected. Right? I think it was Harari, the author of *Sapiens*, that mentioned this in one interview, that even religious leaders who claim not to respect science that much obeyed the science, largely, right, about closing churches and mosques and so on. When it came down to it, scientific authority was accepted. And yet, it doesn't do the job fully, does it? I mean, there's a respect for scientific evidence, yet authority is something more than that, right? It's about being willing to believe in someone, rather than simply accept the credibility of the research.
Actually, no, you're right, Cherian, because actually the weak link here is the link between the researcher, the academics, and the decision makers, the politicians. It's one thing for academics to speak to the public, to the media, to the audience. That's one. It's very useful. But then you have to convince the politician or to translate the result of your research work into, applicable political decisions. And that's tricky. You need to be a very good politician. It's not the job of course, experts can help. I mean, medical doctors, epidemiologists, and so on can help. But the decisions and the difficult decisions that have to be made, and the responsibilities have to be shouldered by politicians, elected politicians, or legitimate representatives of the community. And that's, I mean, in Hong Kong and elsewhere, we've seen it's never been easy, either because politicians don't listen, and that's something we've been used to in Hong Kong, but also because translating a decision or evaluating the risks and translating a risk factor into political decision applicable is not easy. Again, the principle of precaution can lead to paralysis, actually. And decision makers don't make any decision because there's a risk, and they will be responsible if something bad is happening. Look at the vaccination campaign, which has in Hong Kong been pretty unsuccessful because a number of Sinovac patients got ill. You've got how many? 7 fatalities maybe. But in every vaccination campaign, you've got side effects, and you had for the polio one death for 1 million vaccinated people, for smallpox as well. I mean, there is no decision without risks, and that's something which is very hard for politicians to to accept, and then to persuade the community that again there are risks in any decision they're going to make.
You're having a go at politicians there, but I'll have a go at the media. This kind of nonsense where somebody dies 3 days after being vaccinated, and they announce it and they purr it. They'll say, oh, but there's no connection. But as soon as you say it in the same sentence together, you have automatically turned so many people off from getting vaccinated. And I think that the media does have to really think about a little bit more carefully about how they report these events, because people don't understand risk. They see that it is probably almost certainly unrelated, but they think, oh, it happened after he died, and that's all they'll remember. Instead of the chances of dying are far. Ooh, I can take that off, can't I? The chances of dying are far greater if you don't have the vaccination. It's just risk perception is one of the big problems with the whole thing.
I mean, yeah, I would agree that the media carries some responsibility. Although, to be fair to the media, they wouldn't normally run such a story unless it is also being pushed by an influential newsmaker. Right? So normally
they should learn to stop doing that.
Right. They should, yes. I think it's one thing we try and teach our students in journalism school is, just because someone influential said it, it's not necessarily a good thing to report it uncritically. You do need to make your own checks rather than, it's not enough to factually report someone saying a lie. You need to check whether what he's actually saying is factual or not. Yeah?
Well, what they could do is just simply report how many people died who hadn't been vaccinated that day. And there are so many statistics you can throw out there, very easily to stop it. I think they shouldn't even say it until there's a proven link.
I agree.
Yes, just to comment on what you said, Cherian, about the religious leaders abiding to the scientific authority, and what Jean-Pierre said about political leaders not being reached out by the scientific community. I would say that rather the case of France and India are quite illustrative. In the case of France, Macron was surrounded by the scientific council, and all the best scholars, researchers, academicians in France did say what would happen and how to handle it. And Macron chose not to listen to it. So it's not a matter of not reaching out. It's the political leaders who made a particular decision. In the case of India, it was exactly the same. Why we have this wave in India? Because there were several religious festivities, and there was no measures to tell people, do not go out, do not celebrate. Mr. Modi continued his political campaign, which he lost in certain regions, and there were huge gatherings. So the scientific community was there, the information was there available to him, and he chose not to. So I think, again, it's a matter of choice.
I think there just one thing on French context. I think there were conflicting views from the scientific community. I mean, that's and on many issues that the problem the scientists don't agree with each other, and the conflicting views tend to lead politicians to not to make any decision. But Macron is a special case, maybe because he doesn't like to listen too much. But the fact, I mean, again, I mean, there were conflicting views coming to him, and that's complicated the whole thing.
Which is, I think, that raises an important point. I mean, we put the hard scientists on a pedestal, but I'm sure scientists will be the first to admit that they can't definitively answer every policy question, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier the trade-offs between saving lives, saving the economy, on which lives also depend, right? There was that debate in the US now probably a year ago over whether, in some respects, the cure can be worse than the disease, so to speak. Right? Are there these gaps that in understanding and analysis that scientists would readily admit to?
I think definitely in the case of the COVID, yeah, because it was a completely new concept. You know, when it started in 2019, nobody'd ever seen anything like this before. Nobody had the answers. Nobody knew where it came from. Nobody knew the genetic makeup of it or anything like that. So it was a war against an unknown, unknown menace. And it's moved, I would say, medical science on about 50 to 70 years in terms of research, no doubt about that, at a big cost, having said that. So yeah, there are gaps in the scientific research. There's bound to be when something like this crops up that nobody knows about. It's inevitable. But it will catch up, and it certainly will inform the next wave, But for this wave, of course, the evidence has been a little bit slow, scientifically.
But there are also moral questions that scientists cannot answer. I mean, what is an acceptable level of risk, for example? What is an acceptable cost to the society? How much, well, I guess it boils down to how much is a human life worth, and so on.
I think part of the answer to that is the vaccine that we've discussed, that 1 in every 100,000 may suffer from that. But having said that, it's better to get vaccinated. So, that's a kind of moral, philosophical question, I guess. But we've got to make the right decision.
I would also like to suggest to enhance the health education and health promotion. For example, vaccine has been already there. However, look at the local in Hong Kong or the globally, not many people are willing to take the vaccinations. So there's a call for the health education and health promotion. So I just remembered, just in recently, there an action in America, for example, some people against the vaccination, especially for their children. So I think it's the right time to educate or to send the knowledge, the correct knowledge to the public. So how to deal with the infectious disease. Vaccination plays a key role in this kind of the battle.
For the sake of others like me who did not sit through the entire conference, were there important lessons for Hong Kong in particular? Because I think the situation here is kind of bizarre, almost, we're so lucky to have vaccines available, and yet people just don't want them, which is great for expatriates like many of us who can get them very, very easily, but not an ideal situation, is it?
I think one of the things with Hong Kong is it's a great danger of putting itself in a trap, and it's this pursuit of zero COVID, which is an eminently fine thing to do if it's an interim process on the way to vaccination. That's the ideal, really. But we've got in this circularity now. There's no COVID out there. I mean, to be honest, I think we all know we could probably take our masks off now. Nobody's got it here. It's that level. So people then say, well, I don't need to vaccinate. Well, if you don't vaccinate, you've got to keep your borders closed. If you keep your borders closed, then you can't go anywhere. You can't interact. You have restrictions on social life and so on. So that's the real conundrum. It's how do you get people in Hong Kong to vaccinate? And they really have to just go all at it and give lots of incentives. Hong Kong is such a rich society. Just pay people. I know there's a moral issue about that, but why not? Really, you could get a lot of people vaccinated very quickly if you did that, and then you can open Hong Kong up.
Can I just say that Samson gave a great paper in the last session where Samson was talking particularly about many of these issues, in particular the case of Hong Kong, and And the trust issue, but the broader, more diffuse trust issue, not necessarily trust in the efficacy of the vaccine as much as trust in the other issues that are perhaps not directly related to the vaccine. I mean, without being, even more explicit. But I think in a sense, and that was a really good paper. And some of my work on France has also demonstrated how, initially at least, there's incredible mistrust of vaccines. Maybe with some foundation, that's not really the debate. But what's been interesting in the French context is how, from that backdrop, as we've seen, throughout the conference, because there've been lots of French people here, that high level of mistrust generally in France and French politics, how we've seen nonetheless, what are the figures now in France? It's moving towards the norm anyway in terms of vaccinations. People are getting vaccinated because ultimately either the message is getting through or they're making the calculation that it's worth it. So I think there's no situation that can't be sort of moved. But obviously there are extraneous variables that are not purely health and scientific ones, and those, they're actually quite difficult to cope with in a way.
I think there is a genuine, in relation to that, I think there is a genuine fear among some individuals about getting the vaccine. They think they're the one in the 100,000. They definitely believe that, there's no doubt about that. And I think there's a massive psychological component attached to this, a non-medical one or a physiological one or a social one, but a massive psychological component that's related to that problem.
Well, I take it the conference didn't offer silver bullet to solve the problem.
No, but I think quite something maybe a number of Hong Kong people are not fully aware of is how lucky we've been in Hong Kong in the last year or so. There has not been any real lockdown. I don't think the Hong Kong people know what a lockdown is when you have to stay at home for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month. Allowing to get out just once a day to buy food, not allowed to go beyond maybe 1 kilometer from your home. I mean, we never had that in Hong Kong. We've been very lucky. That's the first thing I would like to say regarding Hong Kong. The other thing which has not been underscored is the fact that on the positive side, in this pandemic, we've been very fast in putting together vaccines. If you compare to previous pandemics or previous epidemics, wasn't the case. I mean, in less than a year, big companies have been able to, secure a vaccine, and of course, for some vaccines for emergency use, but still, it's been very fast. So, and the third thing I would like to say is, human being is very good at adapting to new circumstances, new restrictions. And I think the life after COVID is going to be very different from life pre-COVID life, because we're going to travel less, I guess. We're going to be more aware of carbon footprint for frequent travelers, frequent flyers. And we're going to maybe, use Zoom more often. There will be a mixture. I don't think we're going to go back to square one. Maybe that's the next question you wanted to ask to everyone. But because, it's one of the lessons I'm drawing. Adaptation is...
We're not ready for the future
But
yet.
young people, but some people, I mean, that's what Julien said at the beginning of the conference. Young people have more difficulties adapting to the new environment than the older people, people like me. If I can't get out, I read. And one of the lessons I will draw from Julien's presentation: don't get obsessed with news and Twitter. Don't get hooked up with news and Twitter too much.
I do want to go deeper into this question of the post-COVID, if it ever arrives, future. But maybe we'll save that as a final question. But before that, I wonder if at least some of you could reflect on what a transdisciplinary conference like this has exposed you personally to. I mean, ideally, of course, a conference should, help us generate new questions and frameworks from other disciplines that we can apply in our own. Have you had any eureka moments in the last couple of days that persuade you to pursue new different questions, frameworks within your own area?
Perhaps I'll have a go at that. I think that's a very, very tough but good question. And it's a very legitimate question because the title of the conference is Transnational and Transdisciplinary Lessons from COVID-19. I mean, personally, it was a bit of a pity we had to have two parallel sessions because it meant that I couldn't sit in on Bernie's sessions, which was a pity because they were really, I'm sure, really good, and hopefully we'll have a look at the PowerPoints later on. But I think in a sense, what struck me is this dialogue we've been having, I said, at the beginning of the conference with Professor Baker, with Julien in the Pacific Coffee, because, you know, from sport and political science, you could say, well, these are very, very different sort of games in a way, you know, different sort of disciplines. But, you know, I think we decided to put this conference on partly because, you know, there was a lot of questions in common. The subplot was trust, because for athletes it's actually quite important. This, of course, it's important in politics, it's important for citizens, it's important in institutions. Yeah, we can't define it properly, I agree, but, you know, in a sense, so there are these common themes: trust, transparency, risk, resilience. They're the type that can give rise to multidisciplinary insights, at least. And certainly from my talk with you, Julien, but also your amazing bunch of postgrad students and young researchers, and Gemma, who's, you know, the papers you present were really interesting from a because obviously we're not specialists in your area, you know. But I think the mix of the papers that you presented on that first morning were really very, very insightful from the perspective of, I suppose, political science, if you like. And so we can carry on rising up with basically quite simple questions, I think. But you need simple questions that can play themselves out in different contexts. And those simple questions, they have to be as simple as they can possibly be. If not, or as Roger Scotty would say in his excellent presentation he gave this week, simple but answerable questions, you know. What are the questions that you might actually be able to answer? And I think that's a good point. And we ought to think about this going forward, really.
Yeah. Simple, you mean not burdened with theoretical language, and so, because that's what gets you into a particular discipline as opposed to another. Right?
I think basically, you know, there might be why questions or how questions, but I think in a sense, relatively simple questions that don't necessarily come from political science or philosophy or whatever. Those are the questions where, you know, you can find commonalities and engage in different types of work. But I mean, yeah, so that's been the most useful finding, really. The other point I would just make briefly, and it came out with our session with the economists yesterday, which was actually excellent. I mean, it was mainly online because we had two very fine economists, really, giving their view. And actually, as the debate went on, it became clear it wasn't actually much about COVID-19, that particular debate. Because the heavy variables, if you like, were pre-COVID-19, and COVID-19 might have been an accelerator of trends of debt and so on, but you know, it wasn't actually the main driver of the longer-term evolutions going on in international debt. And I think that's a more general thing that's come out of the conference. And again, today in Jean-Pierre's talk, in a way, it's COVID-19 is important, certainly, but there are these bigger, deeper issues underlying that are actually more important. And COVID-19, well, we'll learn to live with it, and it will change some questions, but it won't actually change everything.
Gemma and Julien are now obliged to reciprocate, return the compliment, and explain how political studies has completely transformed your world.
Well, it's very interesting, actually. I kind of agree with what Alistair said, that if we can de-jargonize things and get a good answer to a simple question. And for example, I know absolutely nothing about economics and politics and things like that. But some of the questions, you know, put in the right way, you can understand and relate to and speak about and converse about. But if it's jargonized too much, you know, you can't do these things. So I think that's very, very difficult. The thing the conference has kind of done for me more than anything is certainly identified the fact that this is a multidisciplinary problem, you know, touching all areas of all research, independent of what it is, if it's societal or psychological or political, it doesn't really matter. That everybody's involved in it at an academic level, and it transcends the academic level into something else, something bigger. And we've got to get a multifaceted answer to the problem, I believe. You know, that medical issues are not the only thing. Okay, we can come up with a vaccine, but we've got psychological problems associated with the vaccine. We've got people dying, you know, some people won't take the vaccine. So that's not quite it. It's part of an answer, but not the full answer, you know. So I think we've got to explore that a bit further and certainly make implementations for the future.
Thank you. Let's move on to a closing and fairly open question about the future. So how do you imagine the world in, say, 5 years after COVID? Is the idea of recovering from COVID a realistic, optimistic forecast? Could we aim even higher? Are there opportunities for a kind of a reboot or a reset that could actually leave us in some ways better off than in a pre-COVID times? Shall we start with Bernhart?
I can go back 500,000 years and try to answer that. About 500,000 years ago in East Africa, there was a major environmental crisis. It actually affected all the world, but we're talking about what our ancestors were. And that resulted in climates drying out and severe pressure. Mammals went extinct, all sorts of things went wrong. And as a result of that, our ancestors changed. And that change involved a change from a technology, actually in hand axes, that went on for 1 million years. No change. The pressure came on, they responded, and they came up with smaller tools, portable tools. And soon after that, we started, the very first evidence of painting your face comes into play. Cultural groups got together. What it did was actually give a flowering, that severe pressure. And I would suggest that certainly on the science side, mRNA technologies, advances in epidemiology, the new knowledge of each other's cultures, how we've responded differently. These are all stimuli. And I think when you look through more recent history, world wars and so on, whenever you have a severe crisis, not long after that, societies tend to do quite well. And I'm not optimistic as of tomorrow, but 5 years, 10 years from now, I think you'll see a flowering of things.
So that's a vote of confidence in human adaptability.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah?
We can do it.
Jean-Pierre?
Yes, partly agree with Bernie. I would start with the downside, with the problems we're going to face. Well, not in 1 million years, but in the next 5 or 10 years. The financial cost of this whole story. Look at how much money Joe Biden has put in the system. How much money, Macron, Merkel, and other leaders, Boris Johnson, have decided to spend in order to get out of the crisis. Someone will need to pay that, and I'm worried because it means that there will be inflation. So people with savings are going to lose part of their savings. And there will be an increase in taxes, of course. Well, that has already started because the Democrats, when they're back in power, they like to increase taxes as their own inclination. But in this particular context, is going to be a burden for the economy, the world economy. Now, on the positive side, a number of things have happened. Yes, progress you've made, health. It's amazing how religions, I don't know which positive, it's more neutral to me, but religious activities, that's been mentioned by Julien at the beginning. I think, yes, people need faith in a way, more than before. But finally, there's big debate about democracy versus non-democracies. What I can see in that crisis, because of trust or lack of trust, first of all, there is more need for transparency, I think, accountability, but also, and it started in France with the yellow vest some years ago, but it's going on with the crisis. I think there is more need for direct democracy, and everywhere. So it can take different forms, but people want to. People are citizens after all, and they want to get involved in the way policies are made and then implemented. So I'm not too pessimistic, whether an authoritarian system which is able to securitize the society is better than others. What I can say that in democracies there's been a lot of criticism, lack of trust. But at the same time, I don't see any democracy being converted to non-democracy or a more authoritarian system. Well, some people are pushing for that, but they are minorities. By and large, I think what people want is more accountability, more transparency, and more democracy.
We're seeing, I guess, more precision in the debate about democracy and authoritarianism, right? That brings in issues like accountability, capacity, even just basic state capacity. Right? If you may be democratic, but if you don't have the capacity, it doesn't help, and so on. So hopefully that more refined debate will help us shape regimes.
Leadership with authority.
Right. I wonder if we could switch. I want to leave the last word to you, Alistair. So we should switch to over here.
I think as a global population, prior to the pandemic, we were doing very little physical activity, and that includes children, females, all genders, all ages. And as a result of that, obesity has been on the increase, and obesity has been related very closely to the onset and the spread of COVID and death rates from COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So I think as a result of the pandemic, particularly in children, because of the changes in lifestyle, the online systems and the way our lives will change, lack of travel and things like that, it'll be very, very difficult to redress that decline in physical activity. I think the physical activity levels will decrease even further, and hence result in increases in diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all those other things, cancers. And it'll be extremely difficult post-pandemic to stimulate physical activity again, because the people who've been in lockdown, particularly the children, will get used to that, very much so. And the emphasis to get physically active will be kind of lost on that generation. So we could see a generation of individuals coming through the system who are very, very prone to those diseases we've just mentioned. So that's a major problem for me. I think that I agree with Jean-Pierre about the leadership of the politicians. And strangely enough, although they get some good scientific advice, they seem to have got different agendas. The scientist has got his or her agenda, and the politician's got his or her agenda. They don't match up somehow. So I think that's quite an important point. But certainly for me, the physical activity one is the most pressing one in the future.
So face painting that Bernhart talked about is not sufficient. That doesn't qualify as physical activity.
No, they need to get
Those guys were fitter than we are.
They need to get their heart rate up a bit. Yeah, they were at the time, yeah, you're right.
Yes, the pandemic ruined the good habits in keeping regular exercise and have the healthy food. So it's easy to ruin a good habit, but it's hard and it needs time to reform or rebuild up the good habits, health-related habits. So that's why, from my opinion, I can expect the heavy burden from the exercise or other health-related behaviors related health problems. For example, diabetes, obesity, and also some mental issues. So I think it's the time to pay attention to think about how to reform the good behaviors. And Professor Baker is currently leading research. We try to adopt a new approach to try to promote the exercise. So it's a tele-exercise using the Zoom, the live online the way to deliver the supervised training exercise. So that's. I'm sorry, at this moment, not yet. But yeah, we aims to promote the effect exercise intervention to the public in the future. Hopefully not take too long time.
We look forward to that. Emily, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you, Cherian. I certainly concur with every prediction that my colleagues have made. So I don't have any particular prediction, but I do have a wish addressed to the Hong Kong SAR government. as brilliantly demonstrated by Dr. Samsonian, my colleague at GIS, 37.2% of the people in Hong Kong are vaccinated. So there is a strong mistrust, and we have discussed about this. Samson also demonstrated that incentivizing by paying people to get the vaccine would not work. So the question is, how can we incentivize people to get the vaccines? Just in the panel before, Thomas Gnocchi mentioned that last night the EU agreed with the vaccine certificate. So any EU residents who got vaccinated can go all around EU states without any restriction. So Hong Kong is certainly a cosmopolitan international city with a huge international labor force, from domestic helpers who are vaccinated to university professors. Many of us are here today. And many of us last summer did not get to travel. It's not just for tourism, it's just to go back home to see our families. So it doesn't really make sense, for people who are vaccinated to continue to impose onto them the 21 days or 14 days quarantine. So, and there is scientific evidence. There are lessons learned from the EU states to allow vaccinated people free movement. So I think Hong Kong SR government can also take those lessons from elsewhere and apply to the people who are vaccinated. And that could be indeed an incentive for other people to get vaccinated.
Thanks, Emily, for that, and thanks, colleagues. It was good to have Tom Nucky next to us, explaining about this new scheme. I hope it'll be operational when I get back there this summer, and I hope I can get to the UK as well, because that's proving quite difficult. But then many of us are in this position where we'd like to go back basically and see family for a while, but because we haven't been, a couple of years, whatever. But anyway, coming back to think of that's the past. Thinking of the future, I think there's one or two things, just picking up from one or 2 points from my colleagues, and then I'll have a final comment. I think Jean-Pierre's point was very interesting there about the economic challenge of future years. Who's going to pay? Is it taxes? What's interesting is there's a strong group of economists on the left in France in particular saying, no, well, we're just not going to pay. We're just going to cancel the debt. And I know that you, in a sense, I agree with you. You're sort of shrugging, with your whatever you've just done. I agree with it. But it's interesting because, in order to keep my language up, I very often follow the French media. And it's true that, the number of times the messages come across which says basically, we don't have to reimburse this debt, actually. We don't have to reimburse it. It's our debt. If we have a sovereign currency, we just print more currency. We don't have to reimburse it. And I just, I think that position is, it's certainly a position that takes a particular view on the future evolution of the economy. And I think it's actually quite a risky one, because in a way, as soon as if you let that message get out, then I think that's actually, in the long run, probably making the problems worse that our societies will face. We heard about Argentina, actually. We had a very good presentation that brought in the Latin American experience. And I think we have to be a little bit careful economically what we do in our societies about how to pay off this debt in a way. And I think there will be questions of geographical equity, but there are also questions of generational equity. It's clear, and what struck me with the findings of Julien in the first day was how basically the youngest generations are the one that were suffering the most, psychologically at least, which is understandable in a way because, they've got longer to live, actually, and they're perhaps not as established in their lives and so on. But I think the basic, I think this crisis throws up some really important questions of solidarity between countries, between generations, between social classes, if you like. And I think those are the big questions that we probably have to look to collectively. I'm a reasonably optimistic type, as people who know me know. And so I think I'll nonetheless come down for resilience, adaptability, finding new ways. And the incredible advance in science in the last year that you talked about. You know, it's been extraordinary. We can criticize AstraZeneca or whatever, but, you know, I mean, in actual fact, the advances in the science have been unbelievable in the last year, you know. And so that's been a real accelerator. And I think, you know, on that note of optimism, that's the way forward I would like to, you know, that's the picture I would like.
Thank you. Thank you all for wonderful discussion. I hope the audience and here as well as online learned a lot from it too. The diverse wisdom on this panel. And please join me in thanking them.
Thank you, Cherian, for chairing the session so well.